Welcome to the Future Tech edition of the Finding Genius podcast. Forget frequently asked questions, forget common sense, common knowledge, or Googling for information. How about advice from a genius in their field instead? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5% go above and beyond. They become very good at what they do, but only 0.1% are the geniuses of their profession. Richard has made it his life's mission to interview the geniuses of their fields in areas such as AI, 3D printing, quantum computing, blockchain and Bitcoin, and more. Don't miss out on amazing podcasts with geniuses. Review us on iTunes or wherever you listen, and go to futuretech.findinggeniuspodcast.com and subscribe today.
Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech edition of the Finding Genius podcast. My job here as host is to find the geniuses in their various fields. I've interviewed over 2,000 scientists, researchers, clinicians, and product people. And today I have a great guest, Guillermo Cecchi. He's an IBM research staff member dealing with computational neuroscience. So Guillermo, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
Very good. Not so cold.
Oh, not so cold. Where are you?
I'm in New York, but today it was like 50, which is incredible for February.
Nice. Yeah, one time and recently, a few years ago, I was in New York on Christmas Eve. It got up to like 69, which was crazy at night.
That happens. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, enjoy it while you can. So, very good. Well, Guillermo, tell me about your work. It spans a lot of areas. What are you researching right now?
So I managed a group that we call Computational Psychiatry and Neuroimaging. So I deal primarily with data from mental health patients, and what we're trying to do is formalize metrics to monitor progression and prognosis of different mental health conditions using data that all the data we can have access to, but so far the main focus for us is speech and a little bit now of video data. And the neuroimaging part is self-explanatory. It's using imaging in humans, so that is magnetic resonance, so functional and structural. And that's the main mission of our group. As a secondary mission, I also have a connection with artificial intelligence researchers here in the lab. And what we're trying to do is both trying to understand how we can model certain mental health conditions using AI techniques, but also it's a bit more ambitious, try to bring ideas from what we know about the brain in order to create more interesting AI models. Right? But that's again, it's almost like I said, the secondary mission that we have, because just dealing with problems related to mental health keeps our hands more than full.
So you're trying to model mental illness with AI, or what are you trying to model specifically? Like what kind of conditions?
We are looking at pretty much all the major conditions that affect the population, right? From psychosis and schizophrenia, mania, to depression, anxiety, drug addiction, and then all the neurodegenerative disorders, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, among others. So we are trying to model the symptoms and measure the symptoms in a sort of analytic, algorithmic way. And from a more abstract point of view is, can we understand the behavior of a patient, for instance, with addiction, with certain artificial intelligence models that will mimic the behavior, and see if we can use that to model in particular behavior, understand if there are particular patterns that might be predictive, just from modeling point of view, right? But that, again, that's sort of the other side of the same coin.
Well, okay. So what, have you had any success with the modeling, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, so, I can point to perhaps is the example that I like the best. And this is a success that we had in predicting outcomes in psychosis. Specifically, we've been working with colleagues who study what's called clinical high risk for psychosis. And this is a population that is typically adolescents who have a sub-threshold symptoms of psychosis. They did not have a full-blown psychotic outbreak yet, but given of these sub-threshold symptoms, there is a high risk that they will have such a first episode. So what we did was to take baseline interviews in the clinic, where they, in an open-ended way, they talk about the problems. And these patients or subjects, they are followed for 2 years, and then a number of them really have a full-blown, very dramatic psychotic outbreak. So our task was to see if it's possible to predict who will be convert, who will have a first episode, so that you can target treatment, you can have specific interventions to those. And the way we did it, I think it's a very good representation of how we go about doing things. Talking to psychiatrists, we try to understand what are the main features that they use to characterize this population, both the ones that are sub-threshold and those who regrettably become chronic schizophrenic or manic patients. Okay. And we identified a couple of very prominent features that we thought would lend themselves to modeling. And
what are some examples? What features?
Right. So the one feature is what they call flight of ideas, in a way that is self-explanatory. So these patients tend to flight off the handle, in the sense that they are talking about something and they switch to something completely unrelated. Sometimes this is also called derailment, right? The train of thought is not a nice and linear rail, right? So they jump around when they are speaking. That's, again, called flight of ideas, derailment.
Oh, so they it'll be a series of non sequiturs. They'll just
exactly.
How fast does that happen, by the way? And
I'll give you the more details. So the other feature, the prominent feature that we identified from the ones that are known, but really very prominent, is what they call poverty of speech. So the speech of these patients tend to be impoverished, right? So it doesn't have a deep structure. It doesn't have fluency. So we thought that these two could be analyzed using NLP approach, natural language processing. So regarding the first one, the flight of ideas, and going back to your question, what we did was to look at the semantic continuity between consecutive phrases, right? So at that level of granularity, even between consecutive phrases. So from an NLP approach, what we did was to use ideas of semantic embedding, where you can take the meaning of a word or of a sentence and compare it relative to another one, right? So this is idea that is being used in our phones to define whether we prefer Nike or Adidas or whatever. Right? So we found that a strong signal, in the sense that over the course of an interview, the patients who will later have a first episode at some point have a very significant break in the contiguity of the content of what they're saying between consecutive phrases.
So like without prompting, someone that has
Without
this problem,
prompting,
you'll talk to them
exactly.
and they'll just start going off into like they'll talk about a baseball game and they'll talk about the weather and they'll talk all kinds of stuff. Okay.
Well, yes and no, because and this is interesting part of the story, because in the first study that we did, this was completely open-ended. So these patients were asked to talk about themselves and go on and on as long as they could, right? So in that case, it was really, very generic prompt once, and then it was sort of close to free speech. We also
what
found.
What about asking someone to teach you something or describe something very specific?
Yes. Okay.
And then seeing if that caused them to go off more often.
Yes, I'll come to that. So we also found, as you would expect, a very strong signal in terms of poverty of speech, and that you do with very techniques in NLP that have been around for decades. Just you can take the syntactic structure of the sentences and understand, measure the complexity, right? So we found that those who later convert have diminished complexity from this structure point of view. Now, going back to your question, we did a follow-up study comparing the first one with data from a very similar cohort of this clinical high risk youth, but with a very different protocol in precisely the one that you described. So they are given a story to read, and then they have to retell the story, and the interviewer probes them to see what is understood, how much understood from that story. Even in that case, we found the same thing, right? So the discontinuity in meaning is also present there. The impoverished speech is also there. So for us, what was successful was not only that in each case individually we could find very strong predictors for conversion later, but also that we could map one study to another. We could learn in one study and apply it to the other, even though there is something that we are missing, and that is, unfortunately, and this is fortunately because we are working on it, we didn't include any modeling of the interaction per se, right? So and that's something that we are doing right now, modeling dialogue. So we treat the speech production from the patient as sort of an independent source, which is not, but at least in this case, perhaps this condition is so severe that doesn't really matter too much how you probe them. You have enough information in their speech to predict the outcomes, within this, like I said, 2-year frame. So, this is the case that I like the most, because it's not only other things that we are doing is to see to what extent using speech we can match diagnosis. But
what factors would confound this? Like, what if the person's in a highly emotional, agitated state, or if you ask them just to talk about themselves, but they've had a horrible week, maybe they'll talk about themselves in a disjointed or incoherent way because of that. Maybe that confounds the speech.
There are, and that's something that we are working on. There are probably several possible confounders. One is educational level, right? So speech is very sensitive to that. Content and structure, prosody to some extent. Prosody also reveals to some extent your socioeconomic background, right? Your accent. It carries some information about where you grew up, like in my case. So that's a confounder. Gender, of course, is another possible confounder that we try to incorporate in our studies. Now, in answer to your question, we know that yes, in some cases, these confounding factors can be very significant. But we also have studies in which we are able to deal with that if we can follow a particular individual over time. So, in that case, let me mention a couple of studies. One that came out actually last week, where we identify speech markers of the effects of some psychoactive drugs like an oxytocin, and because we know that those modulate the way we process emotion, right? So, in particular, oxytocin is something that mothers produce when they are breastfeeding, right? So, and ecstasy also has this very strong effect on emotional processing. But the way, and as such, precisely the example that you mentioned, if we target how you're expressing emotions in speech, that may be very dependent on many factors. But in those studies, what we show is that if we have samples of speech at baseline, then we can determine whether someone has ingested ecstasy or oxytocin, and even to some extent at what doses, because we have a baseline. Without having the baseline, yes, things in some cases might be very difficult, but some of the ideas that we are trying to develop are predicated on the possibility of applying this to clinical trials where you can track a patient and see what effect the treatment is producing on them, right? In that case, we solved some of the problems related to all the other things that might be affecting, and we know are affecting speech in particular.
Okay. What are some of the treatments, and what so you want to figure out, okay, now the person is speaking more coherently, they're 10% less flighty, and right. Their level of speech, their poverty of speech is decreased by 15%, and that would be good markers to indicate possibly with your model that the treatment's working.
That's right. So that's exactly right. So I can point to a couple of examples. One is something that we've been working on for some time now with the foundation that supports research in ALS, the Lou Gehrig's disease. And what we do with them is that we take data that is collected from the smartphone of these patients. They record a voice on a weekly basis. And with that, what we can see is that we can track the progression, the deterioration. Unfortunately, there is no treatment so far for ALS, but we can identify whether someone is deteriorating slowly or faster, and we can have an approximation to the clinical measures that it would take, the patient going to the hospital to evaluate. We can do this just with a couple of minutes of speech, and those are essentially motor aspects of their behavior, which are obviously immediately expressed in acoustic information, but also even some cognitive aspects, that are affected by ALS. So that's a concrete ongoing case in which we can monitor patients. In this case, there's no treatment, unfortunately. We have...
What's an example of which, unfortunately, I know it's probably not nice, but have you listened? Have you heard the deterioration? And what does it sound like? Anything that jumps out at you that you said, "Oh, wow, I can hear it."
Yeah, we in principle we that's it's an important topic because in general we don't listen to the audio files. We do some development with mock data, but then we just run the algorithms and extract features, but I can tell you what the features are. So in the case of ALS, what happens is that prosody is directly affected. The pauses between words changes. They become, in some cases, very stereotypical, or they become much less normal, right? Less Gaussian than in a control person. But also,
you mean it's like, do people have like robotic speech where they talk like this?
Right. Or the other extreme is they might have very long pauses between words, which is also, trivially understandable. But also the space between phonemes in words is affected. And then on the sort of high frequency side of it, you start to see a lot of noise, right? And if you do a sonogram in a normal voice, you see these very straight lines. In this case, you start to see, just fuzzy, because it's difficult to control the tension of the muscles, right? So that's what is, so powerful about voice, is because it's representing pure motor aspects, also cognitive aspects. And like I said, with ALS, we can also see how the impairment begins to show an effect in cognition. That's an approximation of all the kind of things that we can do just with voice.
Huh. That makes sense, yeah. Well, I know people have analyzed the stress in their voice and, all kinds of things. So
and it's more than analyzed. We all, we all know that. So as I tell everyone, my mom is in Argentina, so I call her every morning, and the way she says hi, I already know her state of mind, right?
My wife says the same thing.
Yes, exactly. It takes just 1 second, and so much already.
Yep, that's funny. What about detecting the underlying emotions? I'm sure there's plenty of people trying to analyze that. Does that tie into your work?
It does. It does. We do. Yeah. So in the industry, it's called sentiment analysis. The way we deal about it, in particular, given that we try to focus on mental health, is to use clinical markers. For instance, we have work relating speech features to clinical metrics of depression, but also precisely in the experiments that I mentioned before with ecstasy and oxytocin, because we know that there is a strong effect in how people express emotions after they take ecstasy or oxytocin. We also use the markers that allow us to differentiate the same person under no drug and drug as features that we can reuse in other studies, in particular to understand to what extent a certain emotion is expressed. And moreover, and I think this is interesting even beyond mental health, because there are not that many models just in general in eye connecting specific aspects of prosody with content, right? So the way I would say, I love it, or I love it, or oh, I love it, right? I say the exact same thing in 3 different ways, and that conveys a lot of information. And this connection between what is said formally and how it's said is very important in mental health, but it's important in the way we interact with each other. We express our feelings and our thoughts through speech, right? So
is that another marker of people that have mental problems, that
yes, it is.
Say common things in strange ways with strange intonation?
Yes. Something that is very common, in particular in for instance, in schizophrenia, is what's called flatness of affect. So you might be saying, something with formally emotional content, but in a completely flat way from a point of view of prosody, and that's a marker of something that is not working very well, or that might be the case when you talk about yourself or when you talk about other people. And so we are studying what's called borderline personality disorder, that precisely this distinction between how good you feel about yourself and other people can change very dramatically, and both in terms of what you are saying and how you are saying it. But yes, so the short answer to your question is yes, that's a very strong marker of certain mental health conditions. But it's also is very important in just normal speech, right? How we regulate that is extremely important for communication in general.
Oh, okay, very interesting. So to go back to the beginning, you're attempting to model this so that people can do early intervention on people that appear to have mental issues, or what's the end goal?
Yeah, early intervention is very important, and is predicting outcomes is quite difficult, and it's very challenging, and that's why I'm particularly proud of these studies that we did, which are small, so we need to do more, but it's a good direction. The other obvious application is almost trivial, is and we can use the example that I gave for ALS. These patients who have been diagnosed with ALS, how often do they see a neurologist? Well, once a month if they're very lucky, every 3 months. With this, imperfect as it might be, we have a way of accessing the state of the patient, right? So on a weekly basis, we can do it on a daily basis, and have an inkling of where they are. Are they, like I said, are they progressing? Are they declining faster or slower? Or maybe are they improving? In the case of a clinical trial for a treatment, can we see immediately that there is an effect? Can we identify whether it's better for them to take a drug in the morning or in the afternoon, if we can measure the effects on their voice? So that's the other very clear and immediate application of what you can do with voice in particular. Behavior in general, but we are also part of some studies where we use sensors, we're using some accelerometer data, but the richness of what you can get with speech is not comparable.
Yeah, that's really cool. How far along are you in making the model? Is it starting to work pretty well, or is it still in very early stages?
Well, it's not ready to go to the FDA. There are different. We have different projects, and in some cases, the goal is to bring this to the FDA. But
what's the challenge that comes to mind is, could you make this independent of the language being spoken? That would be cool.
Yes. So again, we have partial answers to that. For the case of what's called differential diagnosis of psychosis. So can we identify whether someone is psychotic as manic or psychotic as schizophrenic? And that was one of the first studies that we did a few years back. And actually, the first study that we did was with colleagues in Brazil. We did in Portuguese, and so we have replicated that in most of the major Indo-European languages, right? In English and in German and in Spanish, and we have done something very similar for Parkinson's, again with several languages. We have not done this yet with Mandarin or Cantonese. Hopefully, we're going to get data soon. But that is relatively easy in the sense that someone who develop schizophrenia, for instance, can be very severely affected. So, we don't think that it's a great fit, but the more subtle aspects of it, like I said, can you train a model to detect that someone has ingested oxytocin in New York and apply it to someone who did the same thing in Beijing? Well, that remains to be seen. But I think that it's possible. It's possible. We need perhaps more data and certainly more time. But like I said, we have a few ongoing clinical trials. So we just disclosed a collaboration with the device maker that it's using our technology in a trial for chronic pain, using stimulation of the spinal cord to mask chronic pain signals. And we are using, among other things, voice to track the state of the patients. So, I mean, this is, it's taking shape as we speak. Of course, we need more data. It's ironic that, even now, I have almost as much brain imaging data as I have speech data in my servers, even though, it's probably 1,000 times or more expensive, to acquire, 15 minutes of brain imaging than 15 minutes of speech. But the limitations here is that, we are dealing with personal and identifiable data, so we are extremely careful with that, right? So this is something that we take very, very seriously, and that in a way limits what we can do, because the amount of data that we have, it's limited with respect to what it could be, but that's it's unavoidable. That's what we have to do.
Gotcha. So do you have real people that you're going to be getting this the speech from, or are you having to use made up models of it? Like, can you get real data, or is it a privacy problem?
No, the privacy. What I mentioned, the privacy problem is that we should have, or we could have much more data, but because of all the constraints that are imposed and we comply with, we have a relatively limited amount of actual real data to work and to train our models. But so that's the one limitation that we have compared to researchers who or colleagues who look at, like I said, for instance, recommendation systems for Netflix or Amazon, where you're using media.
If you took out the person's name and everything, why couldn't you get recorded interviews of a whole bunch of people?
Yeah,
why is that so different?
One problem is that voice is considered to be identifiable, right? And the transcribed voice you can use, but still you have to be extra careful to make sure that there are no identifiable there is no identifiable text, that someone doesn't say their address and social security number. So there are all these hoops that we have to jump through to avoid potentially leaking information that no one has consented. Plus, everything we do with consent. So all our data, the data that we analyze, has been collected with specific consent, following protocols, clinical protocols, right? So that it's part of the limitation.
Right. Well, very good. I mean, Guillermo, it's a great project. It sounds like it's going to be super useful once you get it to that.
So. Yeah.
What's the best way that people can find out more? Maybe even volunteer their data somehow.
If you look my name on the web, you will find it. Type my name, IBM. We'll see my webpage, and there is a lot of information there.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, I appreciate you coming. Hopefully, the interview wasn't a flight of questions with a poverty of speech on my end. I tried.
No,
Yes.
I really am very passionate about this. So I love talking about it.
That's great.
You've been listening to the Future Tech edition of the Finding Genius podcast. This podcast is information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed. Review us on iTunes or wherever you listen, and subscribe today by going to futuretech.findinggeniuspodcast.com.